right. Hello. Welcome to yesterlore. Sorry for being a couple minutes late today. I was walking my dog real quick. But welcome to yesterlore, and welcome back to rune poetry, which is what we've been doing for the last couple months now. It's been rune poetry. Today we're going to be starting with the old Norwegian rune poem. But before I started, I wanted to do a little bit of meta discussion about the series. So we're going to continue to do the Norwegian rune poem after this week. And there's also the old Icelandic rune poem that we're going to look at after the Norwegian one. We may do another sort of intermission type episode that isn't rune poetry once we're done with the Norwegian one. Sorry, I'm going to adjust this a little bit. There we go. Cool. So we did the Old Norse. Sorry, not Old Norse. The Old English rune poem. There we go. And we finished that. And then we did a sort of break week last week. We did some Gothic. We looked at Mark 3, part of Mark 3, 26 to 32. That's what we looked at. If people want to see more Gothic in the future, just let me know in the chat or on YouTube comments. If you head over to my YouTube to look at the recordings of these and leave a comment. If you would like to see more Gothic, just know if we look at more Gothic, it will most likely be more Bible stuff. There is some non-Bible stuff we could look at. It's not super interesting in terms of its content. We have some like legal deeds and stuff. But if you would like to see more Gothic in general, just let me know. Also, if there are any other suggestions for things to read, like other than rune poetry, in between the rune poems that we read. I have some stuff planned for after we finish rune poems. But if there's any suggestions for other stuff to read, other old text you'd like me to look at, please suggest them. If it's a language I don't know, and I am not learning or planning on learning, I still am interested in getting those suggestions because I would like to do sort of a redirect type stream where I share resources for other languages that I may not know and how to find people who do cool stuff with those, if that's the kind of thing you want to see. And if it is a language that I'm either learning or know or have some background in a little bit, or I'm willing to do research on, I would love to branch out and do different stuff. So, I definitely invite that kind of feedback and those suggestions. I find those very valuable. So, with that said, next week we'll just keep doing this poem. This poem, or set of poems, really, or I guess this poem, which is a collection of stanzas, kind of like the Old English rune poem, is a lot shorter than the Old English rune poem. As you can see, they all fit on one sort of line of text. There are actually two sort of metrical lines each. I will explain in a little bit. But first I'm going to give some background on the old Norwegian rune poem. So this poem is thought to sort of originally have been composed in the 13th century, so 1200s. And to place this relative to the Old English rune poem, that's believed to be an early Old English sort of original composition that was copied in a manuscript in late Old English, which would be the 11th century, probably, given how late some of the forms are in the late West Saxon that we saw. So it's probably 11th century, and then that was copied by Hicks and then burnt in a fire. Much like that situation, This, the original 13th century composition that this is believed to come from, also was destroyed, but was thankfully copied in the 17th century. So 1600s, I think 1650s was when this was first copied. And then after that, there are a bunch of different copies and a bunch of different documents. I can share, not that. There's one here. This is an example of a sort of copy. Does this one have the date? It does not have the date. Okay. But there are a few other ones that if you'd like to see more, just let me know in the chat if you want to see the other manuscripts. There are quite a few. They're not the original manuscript, though. These are, again, copies, kind of like we saw with the Old English rune poem. So because we're looking at a copy, I thought it would be easier to read it just from a Google Doc, like we did with the rune poem. In fact, this is the same Google Doc that the Old English rune poem is. If I scroll up, there's the Old English rune poem. That's there so we can do little comparisons if we need to. So here we go with the Old Norwegian rune poem. So what's interesting about it, there are a couple things, other than the fact that it was also destroyed and we're also looking at copies of copies of copies, is the meter. So it's thought to be some kind of skaldic meter that is rhyming. This one rhymes. That's a pretty cool feature of it. There's sort of rhyming couplets. There's alliteration in most of the lines. It's not sort of the same pattern of alliteration that we're used to seeing in the other Germanic poetry, but there is some alliteration in almost all the lines. And then there's another line. The second line doesn't have to alliterate, but it does rhyme in some way with the first line. Now what you see are these little interpuncts in between things. These little dots here. We've talked about interpuncts before. It's getting quite annoying that it keeps re-centering me in a different place than I want to be in, so I might just zoom in some more instead. I'm trying to maximize my screen space and stuff. Screen economy. It's a real challenge with OBS. So, oh no, you can't see the runes. You cannot see the runes. That's a problem. Okay. See the runes now? Yes, yes you can. Okay. I might actually do a thing. Okay. There we go. So, like I said, these rhyme. Now, depending on the copy, some of these will actually write out the rune. Some will, or they'll write out the rune and the name of the rune. Others will just write the rune. So we don't know what the situation was. If it was like that copy Hicks had of the Old English, where it was just the rune on the side, and you have to treat it kind of like a riddle. I don't think it's going to be worth treating these as riddles, because many of them were cognates with the Old English ones, so you'd already kind of know the answer for some of these if you remember the other runes. And also they're just not guessable to the same extent, because there's not as much content in the poems. They're shorter. So the first half is going to sort of have some alliteration, not necessarily with the rune, but within the line. And then the second half is going to be after the interpunct. Some of them actually begin before the interpunct metrically. We'll see some examples of that. And it's just going to be some kind of related idea, not necessarily continuing to describe what the rune is, or the rune's name means. I'll also comment as we go on the shape of the runes themselves. Some of them are pretty much identical to the Old English ones, and some of them are a bit different. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and begin with the first rune, which is the same first rune that we had in Old English. If I scroll up to the Old English first rune, we had feoch here. Now, here in the Old Norwegian one, we have, and I'm going to be using like Old Norse pronunciation, reconstructed Old Norse pronunciation. This is fe, fe. And it is a cognate, so it also means sort of like wealth, goods. It's a little bit easier maybe even in Old Norse to see how the Old English word feoch becomes fee. It's the origin of the word fee in modern English, something you have to pay. And it comes from the old word for the cattle. It was originally cattle. And sometimes in Old Norse and in Old English, it still means cattle. Especially in Old Norse, it can still mean cattle. But here it probably means wealth or goods, because I will read our poem. It's Fe walder franda rogi födesk ulver I skogi. Some interesting things, if you are familiar with Old Norse, is these E's at the end, A. This is usually more like E, like it's spelled with an I, E or E, in Old Icelandic and modern Icelandic. It's E there, spelled with an I. But in this sort of Old Norwegian dialect that's being written, they like to end with E, this A here. Also, a lot of the time we'll see an A, where there's more typically an A. That's more common of Old East Norse, but it does happen in this Old Norwegian sometimes. And sometimes A will be used where we're expecting an A in sort of more standardized Norse. And that's just because the spelling conventions were a little loosey-goosey, as we've come to expect. So, the rhyme here is roge and skoge. So, fe walder franda roge, födesk ulver I skoge. And let's start translating. So we have fe, which is the subject. And our verb here is walder, and it means, in this context, it's related to the word wield. This would more standardly be written like V-E-L-D-R, but V and U are kind of variants of each other at this period of time. You'll see some lines there will be a V written, some lines there will be a U written, and that's just what we have in the different copies. It's not super consistent. But this verb is, usually it means to wield, to sort of control. But it could also mean to be a cause of something, or become a cause of something. So in this case, it's actually be the cause of. And what is it the cause of? It's the cause of rogi. Rogi, the word is rog. Rog means strife. Rogi is strife in the dative. I believe this is the dative ending here. So it is the cause of strife or problems. For who? Among loved ones. Frända. This is related to friends, but it has more of a meaning of loved ones, as it did in Old English too. We saw the word freund, and the plural was friend. Nominative and accusative plural was friend. But this is cognate, it means loved ones. So, wealth becomes a cause of strife among loved ones. That's what they're saying. And then we have this second half. Födesk ulver I skogi. So our subject here is ulver, and ulver is wolf. Ulver. It is wolf in Old English, so the W has kind of gone away before a U or an O. That typically happens in Old Norse. So we've got ulver here. So wolf, födesk, and this is the verb föda, and föda means to feed. it is cognate with feed. And it has this ending here in more standardized, normalized Old Norse. It would be furthest. I think it's fithest in modern Icelandic. I could be wrong. My Icelandic is rusty. Modern Icelandic, but I think it's fithest in modern Icelandic. And this sort of ending makes it either, it's what we call a mediopassive, so it could be sort of more of a passive meaning or a more reflexive meaning, like the sense here is probably the wolf feeds itself. The wolf is fed, or the wolf feeds itself I skogi, in the skogur. Skogur is forest, or the woods, in the woods. So wealth becomes or causes strife for loved ones. A wolf feeds itself in the forest. So what did these two halves have to do with each other? Well, the wolf sort of subsisting on its own in the forest is kind of maybe a contrast to wealth being a cause of sort of problems. Sort of a more money, more problems kind of thing, mayhaps. Money is causing drama in the family. A wolf is on its own, and it subsists in the forest. Not entirely. Wolves do hunt in packs, but the idea is like you could have lone wolves that subsist on their own, perhaps. It's a little enigmatic what is entirely meant because we don't have the original manuscript or context of the manuscript. But that is our first. That is our first stanza. So same rune as in the Old English one. It looks the same. This F here, and its cognate meaning. Fe is wealth, just like feoch was in Old English. And there's actually kind of a similarity a little bit with, or I guess more like a contrast with the Old English one. The Old English one was emphasizing like the joy that comes with wealth. It was like wealth is comfort for everyone, but each man should, or each person should deal it out fairly if he wants to be judged well. Like, wealth is good, but share it is sort of the TLDR of the Old English version of this rune. But the Norwegian one says, wealth is problems. Wealth causes problems for loved ones. Wolves feed themselves. A wolf feeds himself in the woods. A little bit more of a negative read on this rune. The next rune is also a very similar in shape. It's identical in shape pretty much to the Old English one. And the name is actually identical in terms of how it looks. It's ur, which is what it was in Old English. Now, ur in Old English meant an aurochs, like a undomesticated cattle animal. Ur in Norwegian does not mean that. Old Norwegian does not mean that. Ur here actually has a different meaning. Ur af illu hjarni, opt løyper rein a hjarni. So, ur in Old Norwegian means dross. Now, most modern English speakers don't know what dross is, so I'm going to explain what dross is. I just realized you cannot see the runes again. This keeps happening. Keeps getting cut off. Okay. It's because Google Docs, every time I click on something, like recenters the page a little bit. Can you see the runes okay? I'm actually going to expand this a bit so it's all the way there. And just make it a little smaller. Not that much smaller. Like, hopefully that is... Maybe that's good. I can be smaller. I'll shrink myself some more. There we go. Okay. It's a little off-center. Okay, it's a lot off-center. like I said earlier, screen real estate is really the main struggle with OBS. So, where were we? Yes, so, dross. What is dross? What the heck is that? If you ever end up sort of working with iron weapons or iron stuff, especially with water, the sort of stuff that comes off the metal that you're working with is dross. That's what dross is. It's a lot more sort of relevant and like salient in the old Norwegian culture, so they had a special word for it, ur. And it was frequent enough to warrant being a rune even. So, ur here is referring to that. And what about ur? Also dross. Dross has some other meanings in English that are kind of related to that same meaning. Dross could just be like any kind of waste product that gets used for that as well. dross is how you spell it in English. It's not a very common word. It's a kind of specialized word. But this is what that means. Or this means that in Old Norse. Ur af illu jarne. Okay, so ur is, so dross is, af, and this af is usually meaning from illu jarne. So jarn here is iron. Kind of sounds a little bit like iron, jarn. And illu here means bad. Like it's related to the word ill in English. So it's from bad iron. If your iron is bad, it's just gonna come right off it. Så, ord af illu jarne. Opt løyper rein og jarne. Opt, sometimes it's spelled with an F. That's how it's spelled in modern Icelandic. Opt means often. We saw plenty of oft in Old English, and it meant the same thing. Opt løyper rein og jarne. Okay, so løyper is the verb here. The subject is actually rein, and this is in sort of more standardized, normalized Old Norse would be rein, and it means what it looks like the first half of, which is reindeer. Often the reindeer leaps. Often the reindeer leaps. Og hjarna. Hjarn is another sort of specialized word. It's snow crust. It's like you have snow, and then it melts, and then it freezes again. And it's sort of more crunchy and like solid. That's hjarn. So the reindeer often leaps on the snow crust, and it's kind of dangerous because like the part under the snow crust might melt again, and so you could like step on it thinking it's solid, and then you go in, and your foot gets frozen or like put in cold water, and then there's risk of frostbite. So this is kind of related in the sense that like the dross is like the waste product of bad iron. Similarly, reindeer often leap in sort of the worst part, the most dangerous part of the snow. Again, kind of a negative vibe with this rune as well. The Old English version of this poem, this was related to the aurochs, and it was an overly horned, very fierce beast that fights with its horns. It's a proud animal. It's just sort of talking about the animal. But the Norse one is like, yeah, bad iron leaves some waste products, and reindeer step in the snow crust. That's what we got. This is very different feel for this rune poem. All right, let's go to the next one. The next one is Thurs, and this is another rune that looks pretty identical in form to, it's just thorn, basically. In Old English, the name was Thorn, and it was talking about a thorn. And that one was kind of negative. It was like if you prick your finger in the thorn, it's gonna bleed. That was kind of the vibe there. This one, we have Thurs, And now Thurs does have an Old English cognate. It's Thirs, which means the same thing, which is basically, it typically gets translated to giant, which I think is not a great translation because it doesn't necessarily mean that the creature was big. It's sort of like a type, more like a species almost of being, or species is the wrong way to think of it. It's not that systematized. It's more like a class of being. Like, if you're familiar with sort of modern fantasy creatures, there's like, you have your elves and your dwarves, and then you have your Thurs, your giants. But giant doesn't mean big, in the sense that giant tends to mean in modern English. It's just they're a different class of being. And sometimes they can be big, but sometimes they can be human-sized. And it's more about their affiliation. Usually they're sort of agents of chaos or destruction, typically. And that's what we see here. Thurs walder quenna quillu, catur warder far af illu. So that's our rhyme there. We have this verb again, walder. So it is the cause of. So a Thurs, an etin or a giant, is the cause of quillu, quenna. It's the cause of quillu. Quillu here is like torment, inflicting pain. It's related to the word kill, actually. The Old English verb is quellan, which is to kill. But this is more like qualu in Old English, like pain, torment. So the giant causes torment, quenna. This is related to, not exactly directly cognate, but it's related to the word queen. Old English is just where we get the word queen from. And it means woman, but this is the genitive plural. So it's like among, kind of like we had with frända, among loved ones. Here we have among women. So a giant causes torment for women, and for others probably, but they're emphasizing women probably because the K alliterates here, quenna quillu, it's a nice alliteration. And then we have catur warder far af illu, and our subject here is far. Far warder, warder here means because. In normalized Old Norse it's verder, verder. And I think it's verder in modern Icelandic too, with a, can't remember if it's a U or an I. I think it's verder. I want to say verder. Could be wrong there. But far is few, and verder is become. Or it sort of indicates a passive voice sometimes too, like is made or are made. Here it's few, far, few, become, catur. Catur is an adjective. It means cheerful, happy. Catur. So few become happy. Af, again, means from. Illu, and we had illu before, bad. We had bad iron here. Here we just have badness, evil. So these sort of giants, these beings aligned with destruction, are a cause of torment for women, and few are made happy by evil. Sort of thematically related idea. Now the next one is where we get our first sort of big deviation here in the Norwegian poem. This rune does not have a form that looks exactly like it. It comes from, in the Elder Futhark, the rune that looks like this, with the value in terms of sort of meaning of this rune, which you can see it just kind of bends back up. In Old English it becomes O. And the meaning was O, of os in Old English, was a little tricky because it means like God, often associated with the god Woden, specifically this word. There are names that begin with this, like Oswald, Oswinna, which there are still people with the names Oswald and Oswin today. That Oz part OS is referring probably to the god Woden, but it just is a general word for God, deity. but it could also be sort of a Latin borrowing for the word mouth. And so we talked about sort of that ambiguity, how the poem could be read in both ways. Now, what happened with the meaning in Old Norse, we're going to see it's different between the Icelandic rune poem and the Norwegian rune poem. The Norwegian rune poem is using a new word, os, with a different meaning. But we'll see when we get to the Icelandic rune poem, they're going to kind of have more like a cognate to the Old English one, and it's going to be very clear that it's the god Odin who's cognate to Woden. So what happens is sort of the early Old Norse, like Old West Norse, word for God was this, os, os. And in normalized Old Norse, eventually that becomes os, and that's what you see in sort of like Old Icelandic a lot of the time. But what happened in the Old Norwegian rune poem is that was sort of reanalyzed as a different word. This word os means an estuary. So like water coming out onto the sea, that sort of land area. Or sort of like the water feature as it comes out, opens up into the sea. And you can maybe see how the shape descends. I'm going to try to copy Ash down a little bit. There we go. You can kind of see how it developed into just like a line with the two lines going through it. Sometimes they just come down and don't go through it. Depends on like the scribe's handwriting, basically. So in the Old Norwegian rune poem, at least this word is estuary. So the estuary, os. Let me read the stanza. Os flastra ferda for. Sorry, I paused at the wrong space because that's not where the line ends. Os flastra ferda for. En skalpur svarda. Os flastra ferda for. En skalpur svarda. So the rhyme is actually ferda and svarda, even though like the phrase actually ends here. So we kind of want to put like a space here because that's where it rhymes. Just a little confusing. That's not typical of this meter, but it happens a couple times in this poem. So os is the estuary, and it is flastra ferda for. So it is the flastra, which means this st here is actually like the st we use for our superlatives in English, the est ending, like if something's the biggest or something like that. This is related, but it is of the most, or sorry, it is the most common of ferð, and ferð means journey. We actually had a cognate in Old English, ferð, and I think we saw that word as well in Old English. A journey, and it's, I believe it's genitive plural here, of journeys, like the most common of journeys. And then we have this word for, which also means journey. So it is like the most common, or this could also mean like a, it could mean a journey, but it could also mean like a way that you do something, or your path. So it's like the most common way for journeys. We can maybe try to include both words for journey in a way that makes sense here. The most common way for journeys, the most common route for journeys, maybe, is the estuary. Like if you're going to ride your ship out onto the sea, it's probably the way you're going to go. And then we have our second sort of half here. Well, technically starts here metrically, but after the sort of grammatical break here, we have en skalpur svarda. So the en here is sort of, it's a conjunction, which sometimes, it usually means but in Old Norse. It's actually cognate to the word and, but the word for and is different in Old Norse. It means but. And they like to begin, sometimes they can mean and. Here it's more like as. As skalpur, and skalpur here means sheath. Svarda. And I think the word here, this is like basically four swords, or of swords. So an estuary is the most sort of common path for journeys, just as the sheath is for a sword. Like sword goes in a sheath, ship goes out of an estuary. That's kind of the comparison being made here. And that's what this rune is referring to here. Or at least the name that they're giving it in Old Norwegian. That's how they're interpreting the name. Alright, I think we could do another one. We've got Raid Quaida, Rossom Wasta. Regin Slå Svärdet Betsta. So, that's a nice rhyme there. Raid is not actually... I don't think Raid is actually the subject here. I think Quaida is the verb, and it has the subject in it. Quaida means they say. This is cognate to quedan in Old English. We saw that verb a few times, especially in the past quath. I think we might have had an example of that. This is the exact cognate. So like they say that Raid, which is riding, it was rad in Old English, and it was the same. And you'll see the shape is pretty much identical most of the time. Little stylistic differences, but it's basically an R shape in both languages, and this is a cognate. It was rad, which meant riding in Old English, and it's raid in Old Norwegian, and it means the same thing, riding. It does not mean road, even though that's where the word road comes from. In modern English, it comes from rad, but it means riding in Old English. Road is usually way in Old English, W-E-G, and there was a compound rad way, the way you ride, the riding way, and that develops into roadway in modern English, where road means riding and way means what we call a road now. So a roadway is the street, and then that gets sort of shortened down to road. And then now we're using road for what we used to use the word way for. That's sort of that shift that happened over time in English. But in Old Norse, it still means riding. So riding, they say riding, and then the next sort of word to interpret is this word over here, wasta, which is worst. It's the worst. They say riding is the worst. Rossom. Ross. This is sort of an Old Norwegian variant of what we'd expect an H here for. Ross is cognate to horse in English. Ross. So rossom is for horses. It's that. Usually it's in sort of more normalized Old Norse, and it's in Old English. We're pretty used to that ending in Old English now. So for horses, riding is the worst thing for horses, they say. We kind of had a similar idea in the Old English rune poem, didn't we? If we go up to rad, we had like sort of similar idea come up with horses, right? We had it's on rechederinka huichum sefans with what to sitteth on uvan mara mayan had. Yeah, so it's the road is hard for people, but it's nice, like it's soft and goes well for whoever's sitting above or upon a horse, mad, a strong horse over the mile paths. So there it was like, it's nice. The riding is nice if you are on the back of a horse. Once again, the Old Norwegian rune poem is kind of taking the negative of that. The road sucks for horses. Riding sucks for horses because horses have to carry you. Let's see it from their point of view, mayhaps. Riding sucks for horses. But then they have something that seems to be completely unrelated in this case. We have Regin Slå Svärdet Betsta. Now, Regin is a character from a few different poems. At least I know him from Prose. I think he is in the Prose Edda, but no, he definitely is in the Prose Edda. But he's basically a dwarf character. Arguably, it's a little murky. His brother is Fafnir, who becomes a dragon. Now, the word Regin actually means, it gets used for, like, power, like the powers of the world, like the gods sometimes. But the singular noun is this guy's name. And it says that he slå sverdet bästa. He slew the best sword. Sverdet here is the sword. It's best sword, bästa. Now, slew, what did it mean slew? How you slay a sword. You slay with a sword, don't you? Slå, slåa, I think it's the verb. Slaw. I'm forgetting what the infinitive is. But slå here is slew. It's cognate with slew. But in both Old English and Old Norse, the verb is slan, slan in Old English. It can mean just any kind of striking that you do. And here it's probably more like he forged the best sword, because it does say that he forged some nice swords. That's a thing that dwarves tend to do in Norse mythology. They like to make weapons that are really awesome. So Regin forged the best sword. Okay, good for him, but what does that have to do with horses suffering when we're riding them? Your guess is as good as mine. This is one of the second halves that doesn't make quite as much sense with the first half. All of these are kind of a stretch, a little bit, but some more than others, and this is definitely one where I'm stretching it, but I can't make it reach the horse half of this stanza. So we're going to move on to the next one. Now, this is where we get a very different meaning and name, kind of like we had with estuary. Actually, we've had a few that are pretty different, but this is also our first instance of a rune that's almost identical, but it's flipped. So if we go back to exactly where we would be in the Old English rune poem here, after Rad came Cain, and Cain meant torch. Talks about torches being like, a source of light, burn bright, etc., etc. It's good to have lighting in your house, was sort of the gist of this stanza. But if you take that rune and flip it over, and kind of round it a bit, because of what this font likes to do, it likes to round them a bit more, you get this. So it's just kind of flipped vertically, is what's happened with this rune. And there's a few that are flipped vertically in the younger Futhark that we're seeing here. But the name of this rune is Kaun. Kaun baikja barna bol görver non folvan. Now, we have a problem here. The problem is that this does not rhyme. And I have looked at some of the different manuscript copies and seen what they did with the fact that this doesn't rhyme, because they all tried to fix it. If you look at the oldest copy, I think this is what you see. You see Baikja barna bol görver non folvan. It doesn't rhyme, is the problem. So what many of them do is they actually break up the word here and do fal varna. And that changes the meaning a bit. So let's actually look at what the meaning is before we do that. And then there are a few different sort of emendations, and I'm going to show you the one I like best, because it makes it rhyme without changing this word, actually. And it makes more sense to me, personally. So, kaun means ulcer. It's an ulcer. Ow. And what it says is kaun baikja barna. Now, barna is a word we've seen cognates of in Old English. Barn means child. It's barn in German, I think, as well. It's child. Or it's not the main word for child, but I think there is a cognate barn in, I believe there is in German. I might be wrong. I don't speak German. But it means of children here. It's the genitive plural. It would be barna in Old English, and it would be the genitive plural. Now, Baigya here, I think it's Baigya. Baigya, I think is how you pronounce it actually. Baigya. I think it's Baigya. Would be sort of like, it's like bending. It's to bend of children, which doesn't make that much sense grammatically, but okay. And then the second half, like, I mean, if you have an ulcer in your child, you're gonna like bend over in pain, maybe that's what it's saying. And then we have bal. Bal means death. There's a cognate in Old English, balu. I think we saw a word with that appended to it. We might have, but yeah, it's bal. It's death. We have the word bale. That's sort of archaic in English. Like if something's baleful, it's deadly. And then we have this word gurur. Gurur. Sometimes we say it as gurur. Actually, it's right down here as gurur. There are lots of different variations of this verb. It shows up as like gurva, gerva. In modern Icelandic, I think the verb is just gera. But yeah, I think it's gera, yeah. But it shows up in a bunch of different forms. This is the conjugated form. Here it's death. And this verb means to do or to make. So death makes non-falvan. Death makes then. Non is the corpse. It's a corpse. There is a cognate in Old English, na, which means corpse. And what does it make the corpse? It makes the corpse falwan, which is cognate with fallow in Old English, and it means fallow, or it's the origin of the word fallow. It means pale, though, in Old Norse. So death makes the corpse pale. That makes sense. That makes lots of sense. Now, the full death makes paleness varna. I actually forget what, so the sort of the stem would be varn. I think that's, oh no, I'm forgetting what that means. I need to check what varn means real quick. It's not a very common word. A lot of the manuscripts will make this varna because they want it to rhyme with barna. And it's a word that starts with a V, so why not, you know? I guess it sort of makes sense. Oh yeah, okay. Oh yeah, that's the root. Okay, so here's why I think it makes no dang sense. So varn, it is from the root, like we saw in, I think we saw an example in English, veria means to ward off or to protect. Varn is defense. And so varna would be like of defenses. So like death becomes the of defenses. I have trouble making work grammatically, but even if you could, like the defense from fallowness, it's hard to make work. I would rather keep this falvan. My favorite emendation that I saw, and that I personally think works better, is that you actually have a repetition where it's actually, this should be the other way around. Begya is there by mistake, mayhaps, or corruption, and this should actually say balvan here, and now balvan rhymes with falvan, because this makes a lot more sense. Here, balvan would mean deadly. So, an ulcer is deadly to children. Death makes the corpse pale. So now we have a kaun barna balvan, bol yerver anan falvan, and now it rhymes. I can't make begya work, and so some people who've emended it to this have just decided to not even try to make begya work and just say it must have been some kind of scribal error or something. I don't know how to make it work. So that is my emendation it's not my emendation, I didn't make it, but I agree with this one, even though it's probably the most dramatic one. It just puts things where they belong, in my opinion. So I'm just going to leave it like that. I prefer it like that, but we'll deal with that. I think we have time for at least one more. The next one is hagall. Now, hagall is our first sort of jump, or sort of leap in runes, because if you remember from many weeks ago, now, when we were looking at a comparison of like the different, if we were looking at a line of the Elder Futhark, and we're looking at which is what the Old English is based on, and then we looked at the Younger Futhark. The Younger Futhark has 16 runes, whereas the Elder Futhark has 24. And the Old English has even more than 24. It had 27 or 9 or something like that. So we have a lot fewer in the Old Norse rune poem. So after Cain, in Old English, we have Yivu and Wain. And then we have Heil, which is hail. Now, Heil is the cognate to the Old Norwegian hagall. But look at its shape. It doesn't look like what Heil looked like. Heil just looked like an H, kind of, maybe with like 2 lines going down. This one, like 2 lines in the middle. This one looks identical instead to Jord, or Yar, that we saw that was like the maybe eel one. No relation between the two. It's a coincidence that they look similar, and we don't really even see this one in manuscripts very much, or at all, I think. Where this one shows up in Old Norse all the time, and it means H. So they just use different shapes for H. I think this does eventually come from the other H-looking one, just through lots of simplification. Now, there is sort of an intermediary stage between Elder Futhark and Younger Futhark, where this is actually used for like an A rune, which is very weird, instead of what we'll see is this one, which is very strange, but we see a lot of that in sort of that intermediary stage between Elder and Younger Futhark in Scandinavia. But well, we see like a few runestones that have it. It's not super common. In most runestones, this is H. So, without further ado, let's read this. So we have hagall kaldastr korna, krister skåp, heimen forna. Okay, so hagall, which again means hail, well, kaldastr, it is the coldest, korna, of grains. We saw corn means grain in Old English too. It's where the word corn comes from. Now, parallel, again, with the Old English rune poem. So this is Heil kaldastr korna. If we go back, hagall, to Heil in Old English, Heil bith huitust korna. That's kind of an uncanny similarity, that both compared hail to grain. Now, comparing hail to grain is not the biggest stretch. It's like a pretty ready comparison. I don't think it's abnormal that they both compare it to grain. What's interesting is they both use the same word for grain, because there are many words for grain in Germanic languages that exist in both languages, but they chose the same cognate word after a superlative. Here it's, hail is the whitest of grain, huitust korna. And then here we have hagall kaldastr korna. It's the coldest of grain. I don't know, it just seems like a very uncanny similarity to me, personally. I think there might be a connection. Maybe the person who wrote this poem was familiar with a version of the Old English rune poem, or something like that, or maybe they'd heard it, or maybe genitive, or not genitive, but this genitive plural of corn with it after superlative, maybe that's some kind of formulaic element. Maybe it's sort of like a cliche, like the somethingest of corn is some kind of cliche phrase. That's possible. I've only seen it with hail, though. And I've seen it in the 2 rune poems, basically. So it just seems like an uncanny similarity. Again, then we've got Krister skåp, heimen forna. So, skåp is our verb here. This is cognate with shape. It would be shelp, in Old English. So our subject here is Krister, and that's just Christ. It's Christ in Old English, Krister in Old Norse. So Christ shaped heimen, and heimen is in sort of more standard Old Norse. This would be like heimin, with an I here and an E here. Heim, though, means world, like a world or a realm. And so it's the world here. This suffix makes it definitely, it's like the word the being added, like we saw with this et here, the sword, best. Here it's the world. Forna means before, long ago, a long time ago, in the past. So, hail is the coldest of corn. Christ shaped the world long ago. I guess it's just things that are true. I'm trying to see the connection there between those two, but yeah. Things that are self-evidently true maybe is what's being compared there. Hail is the coldest grain. Jesus made the world a long time ago. This sky is blue, etc., I guess is the idea there. So that is the... we are one away from being halfway done with the Norwegian rune poem. So next time we won't have to go through the same sort of background preamble because I talked a little bit about the history of this poem. So we might actually finish next time with the Norwegian rune poem. As we can see, the stanzas are a lot shorter, so that makes sense. So we're going to finish faster. And then after that, we can do an intermission thing again. And then we can start the old Icelandic rune poem after that. So if you have ideas for like things you want to see in the interim between the Norwegian and Icelandic rune poem, if we take a break week like we did with the Gothic last week, please let me know in the YouTube comments, or I think there's some way to contact me on my Twitch. There should be. So please let me know. I would love to take suggestions. And if it's something I can't do, I still want the suggestion because I'm going to do sort of a compilation video, like I said earlier, of places you can find those things. At some point I would like to do that. So thank you everyone for watching, and I hope you have a great rest of whatever your time zone is. Thank you, and goodbye.